The notice went up on a Tuesday morning in late October, taped to the inside of the front window where the whole street could see it. A single sheet of paper with a real estate company's logo at the top and a price in bold numbers at the bottom. And between those two things, a listing description that said nothing about the 71 years Otis and Ruth Caldwell had lived inside those walls. It said nothing about the garden Ruth had planted in 1987, the one that still put out tomatoes every August even though her knees had stopped, cooperating with the kneeling a long time ago. It said nothing about Otis's workshop in the garage, the smell of cedar and WD-40, the shelf of clocks he had repaired for half the neighbours on Delmont Avenue for free, because that was just what you did. The listing said 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, original hardwood, and price to sell. What it did not say was why, and for a few days, the people on Delmont Avenue did not know why either. They found out the way you find things out in a neighbourhood that has been the same neighbourhood for 40 years. Someone talked to someone, and someone else filled in what the first person had left out. By Thursday evening, the word had passed from the Okafor house at the corner, all the way down to the Mendozas at the far end. And when Delmont Avenue went quiet that night, it went quiet with the particular weight of something that was very wrong. Otis had been in the hospital 3 times in 18 months. The first time for his heart. The second time for what the heart surgery had missed. The third time for something the doctors described in terms Ruth could not repeat without her voice breaking. Something long and serious and ongoing, requiring not one medication but a shelf of them, requiring not one specialist but 3, requiring the kind of sustained, grinding attention that a retired school custodian and a woman who had spent 30 years taking in laundry and ironing other people's dress shirts simply could not purchase on what remained of their savings. The bills had arrived the way trouble always arrives. First 1, then 2, then a stack that did not fit under the ceramic rooster on the kitchen counter anymore. Ruth had started keeping them in a shoebox. Then 2 shoeboxes. She had not told Otis about the second shoebox. He had enough to carry. The house on Delmont Avenue was the only asset they had. It had been paid off in 2009, the month after their youngest grandchild was born. And Ruth had made Otis take a photograph of the final payment confirmation, which she had framed and hung in the hallway next to the school portraits. The frame was still there. The house was going to have to go. Think about something that somebody you love has given up without being asked. If you have ever watched that happen, you know exactly what this story is carrying. Stay with it. The Caldwells had not told the street. That was the thing about Otis and Ruth. They were not the kind of people who announced their hardship. Otis had grown up in a house where you did not put your trouble on the sidewalk strangers to step over. And in 63 years of marriage, he had carried that disposition into everything. He still wore pressed slacks to church. He still stood when a woman entered the room. He still brought Ruth a cup of coffee every morning at 6:15, setting it on her nightstand with a saucer under it, the way her mother had taught her a cup of coffee should be delivered. He did these things while the shoeboxes sat in the bedroom closet and the listing went into the real estate company's computer. Ruth, for her part, had told no one except her sister in Cleveland, and her sister had told her to pray, which Ruth was already doing, which her sister knew, which was why her sister had said it. The first person on the street to act was Claudette Okafor. She was 53 years old and had lived 3 houses from the Caldwells for 22 years. And she had not once in those 22 years seen Otis walk past her front porch without stopping to ask after her children by name. All 4 of them, in order from oldest to youngest. When her husband had died of a stroke 8 years ago, and she had not known how to manage the furnace, Otis had come over in January, in the cold, and fixed it without being asked, and then refused the money she tried to press into his hand. She had watched the listing go up from her front window, and had stood there for a long time before she picked up the phone. She did not call a charity. She did not call the church, though the church would be involved before this was over. She called Marcus Webb, who lived across the street and worked in commercial real estate, and who she trusted to tell her whether what she was thinking was possible or foolish. Marcus was 41, direct, and did not words. He listened to what Claudette said and was quiet for 4 seconds, which was how he thought. Then he said, "Let me make some calls." What Marcus did in the next 72 hours, nobody on the street knew in full until much later. He called a lawyer he knew who did real estate closings, a woman named Deirdre, who had grown up 2 neighborhoods over, and who owed Marcus a professional favor that she had been trying to repay for 3 years. He called the pastor of the Caldwell's church, a man named Reverend Sams, who listened without interrupting, and then said, "Lord have mercy," in a way that was not theatrical at all, but simply the first honest thing available. He called his own mortgage broker and asked a question about a specific kind of title instrument that he had never had occasion to use before. He made a spreadsheet on his laptop late Thursday night, working at the kitchen table after his kids were asleep, and what the spreadsheet showed him when he finished was that the numbers were possible. Not easy. Possible. Friday morning, Claudette knocked on the door of every house on Delmont Avenue. She did not use a flyer. She did not make it official. She went in person, which was the only way you did something like this, and she told each neighbor what she had pieced together about the Caldwell situation, and she told them what Marcus had found, and she asked a single question. Not for a commitment, just for a yes or no on whether they wanted to hear more. Of the 19 households on the street, 17 said yes. 1 said they would have to think about it. 1 was out of town. That evening, 11 people gathered in Claudette's living room. Marcus stood at the end of the room with his laptop open and a yellow legal pad on the coffee table and walked them through what he had found. The mechanism was something called a community land trust, adapted, though the lawyer Deirdre had another structure in mind that was cleaner and faster given the timeline the Caldwells were working against. The Caldwells' real estate agent had given them until the end of November to accept an offer or drop the price. That was 5.5 weeks. The amount owed across both shoeboxes, which Marcus had gotten from a careful conversation with the Caldwells' daughter in Memphis, who had been trying to figure out the same thing from 600 miles away, was $214,000. The house, at current market, would sell for just over $300,000. After the agent's commission and closing costs, the Caldwells would net somewhere around $270,000, enough to clear the debt and have $50,000 left over to live on in a rental for maybe 2 years before that was gone too. That was the plan they were on. Marcus paused and looked around the room. 11 people looked back at him. He said the street could do something different. He talked for 40 minutes. He had done his homework. What he proposed was not charity in the way the word is usually used, which is to say it was not a gift that costs the giver nothing and puts the recipient in debt to a feeling they did not ask for. It was a buyback, a structured, legal, real estate buyback, in which the neighbors would collectively purchase a shared interest in the Caldwell's property at its assessed value, which would immediately generate enough to retire the medical debt in full, while leaving the Caldwells as residents with a protected, legally binding right of occupancy for as long as they lived. The neighbors would not profit from it. The return was not financial. The return was that Otis and Ruth Caldwell would not have to leave Delmont Avenue. A woman named Phyllis, who had lived on the street the longest of anyone present except the Caldwells themselves, sat very still through the whole presentation and did not say anything until the end. Then she said, "How much per household?" Marcus told her. Phyllis nodded once, slowly, and said, "I'll take 2 shares." The room was quiet for a moment after that, and then it wasn't. What the Caldwells knew, at that point, was that they had a listing in the window and a real estate agent who called Ruth every few days with a gentle professional optimism that Ruth found harder to endure than the bills. What they did not know was that on the other side of that window, on the street they had given 40 years of small daily kindnesses to, something was being organized on their behalf. Their daughter Lorraine knew. The Reverend knew. The lawyer Deirdre was drawing up paperwork, and Marcus Webb was working from his kitchen table every night, rechecking the numbers, sending emails, fielding the calls from 2 neighbors who had questions and wanted to understand exactly what they were, signing before they signed it, because that was the right way to do it, and Marcus respected that. The Caldwells' next-door neighbour on the south side, a retired postal worker named Henry, did not come to the meeting in Claudette's living room. He was not home when Claudette knocked. He came home Saturday morning to find a note from Claudette on his door, and he read it standing on his porch in his coat, and then he went inside and called her. He was on the phone for 12 minutes. When Claudette hung up, she sat down at her kitchen table and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, because Henry had told her something about Otis that she had not known. Henry had said that when his wife was sick, and I missed 2 weeks of work to be at the hospital, I came home to find my porch shoveled and a pot of Ruth's soup on the step. Every day for those 2 weeks. He said he had never told anyone that. He said, "Tell me what I need to do." The only person on the street who knew the full picture in real time was the Caldwell's daughter Lorraine, who had driven up from Memphis the previous weekend, and who had sat at her parents' kitchen table and gone through both shoeboxes with a yellow highlighters and a terrible focused calm, while Otis watched from the doorway and Ruth kept refilling her coffee cup. Lorraine was 51 years old and worked as a hospital administrator, which meant she understood medical billing in a way that made the numbers in the shoeboxes even more enraging than they might otherwise have been, because she knew what every line item was for, and she knew what it had actually cost before the markup, and she knew exactly how a $214,000 debt accrues when you are an elderly black couple in a country that does not have a word for what the healthcare system does to people who did everything right. She had been in contact with Marcus for 3 days. She had not told her parents. Otis went to the workshop in the garage on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks before Thanksgiving and stayed there for 2 hours. He was working on a clock that belonged to the Mendozas at the end of the street, a mantel clock that had belonged to Mrs. Mendoza's mother and had stopped working during a power surge. He had already fixed the movement. What kept him in the workshop longer than the job required was that he did not want to go back into the house and look at the front window. The listing was still there. He had stopped letting himself think about it by thinking about the clock, about the small, precise work of a thing that could be set right if you understood how it was built and were patient with it. He did not know that the listing would be taken down in 11 days. He did not know that Lorraine had been in a conference call with Marcus and the lawyer Deirdre the night before, that the paperwork was nearly finalized, that 14 households on Delmont Avenue had committed funds, and 2 more were expected to confirm by Monday. He did not know that Reverend Sams had quietly reached out to the church's pastoral care fund, which contributed a portion that Marcus had not expected and which closed the last gap in the structure, without anyone on the street having to stretch further than they had already stretched. He did not know that Phyllis, who had said she would take 2 shares, had called Marcus the previous Wednesday and asked to take 3. He set the mantel clock back together with the patience of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and who found in the small gears and springs a kind of conversation that never disappointed him. He listened to the clock tick, steady even, each second the same as the one before it. He thought about the house. He thought about the room where his youngest grandchild had been born, the one they had converted to a sitting room with the blue curtains. Ruth had made herself. He set the clock down and looked at his hands and did not let himself think past the end of November. The meeting with the Caldwells happened on a Sunday, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, in Claudette's living room again, because Claudette's living room had become, without anyone formally deciding this, the street's working room for the project. Ruth had been invited over on the pretense of a conversation about the church's fall fundraiser, which Ruth was the chair of, and which she had been running for 19 consecutive years, and which she had been privately wondering whether she would need to hand off to someone else after the move. Otis had come because he always came where Ruth went. Marcus sat across from them. Lorraine was on the phone, on speaker, though she had driven up the night before, and was actually sitting in Claudette's kitchen, because if she sat in the room she was going to cry before Marcus got through the first paragraph, and she knew it. Reverend Sams was there, quiet, in the chair by the window. Claudette stood in the doorway with her arms folded, not because she was nervous, but because she was trying not to smile. Marcus told them what the street had done. He told them plainly, with the legal pad on the table and the documents in a folder. He named the amounts and the names and the structure. He told them about the right of occupancy and what it meant in practice and what Deirdre had built into the instrument to make it permanent. He told them that the $214,000 was already in escrow. He told them that the listing in their front window could come down today if they wanted. Ruth sat with her hands folded in her lap for a long time after Marcus stopped talking. Otis did not move at all. He was a man who had not cried at his own father's funeral, because his father had raised him to believe that a man holds himself together in public, and he had honoured that, and he had not cried since in any room with other people in it. And that record ended in Claudette's living room on a Sunday in November, while Lorraine listened from the kitchen and tried to hold herself together, and could not. What Ruth said after a long time was very quiet. She said, "We didn't ask." Claudette said, "We know. That's why." It was the plainest possible thing, and it was exactly right, and it needed no further commentary from anyone in the room. The listing came down that evening. Otis took it down himself, carefully, from the inside of the window, folding it once along the middle the way he folded everything, because that was the habit of a man who did not waste things. He handed it to Ruth, and she held it for a moment, and then put it in the recycling bin, which was the right place for it. And they stood together in the front room in the particular quiet of something that had been resolved. 3 weeks later, the paperwork closed. Deirdre had expedited the filing, because she had been motivated in a way that pure professional obligation does not usually generate, and the county recorded the instrument on a Wednesday morning in December. Marcus texted the street. The response was a long chain of messages, most of them from people who are not ordinarily demonstrative in text messages, that lasted most of the afternoon. Lorraine came back for Christmas and stayed through New Year's. She had been planning to start looking at assisted living options in Memphis in January, and she did not have to do that now. And she felt the weight of not having to do it in the way you feel the lifting of something you have been carrying for so long that you had stopped noticing it. She sat in the kitchen on Christmas morning while her father made coffee, watching him move through the room he had moved through every morning for 40 years, putting the saucer under the cup the way he always did, the fluorescent light above the counter making a small ordinary halo of the whole familiar scene. And she did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already hold. In February, Otis finished the Mendoza's clock and walked it down the street and knocked on their door. Mrs. Mendoza's daughter answered, a woman of about 30 Otis had known since she was 9 years old, and when she saw the clock, she put both hands over her mouth. Otis had cleaned and polished the case as well, so the mahogany came up the same deep, warm colour it had been when the clock was new. He told her it was nothing, and she told him it was not nothing, and he told her again that it was nothing, which was what he always said, and she let him say it because that was the exchange you had with Otis, and you did not argue with it. He walked back up the street in the cold, hands in his jacket pockets, the bare trees lining Delmont Avenue casting shadows across the sidewalk, each house lit from inside with the ordinary light of a winter evening. He stopped at his own front walk and looked up at the front window. The listing had been gone for 3 months. In its place, Ruth had put one of the small framed photographs she kept on rotation in the window, a habit she had had for years. Cycling through family portraits and grandchildren's school pictures, and the occasional scenic postcard. The one in the window that week was a photograph of the two of them taken in the backyard in the summer, Ruth's garden behind them, both of them squinting into the sun. He stood there for a moment on the cold sidewalk and looked at the photograph, and then looked at the lit windows of the houses along the street, one after another, and something settled in him that had not been settled since the first shoebox had started filling up. He went inside. He set his keys on the hook by the door, the same hook he had put there himself in 1983 when the door was new, and he called out to Ruth that he was home, and she called back from the kitchen that the coffee was fresh. And the clock on the mantel ticked steady, and even in the hallway, keeping its careful count, Has anyone on your street ever shown up for you the way Delmont Avenue showed up for Otis and Ruth? Leave a comment below and tell us what that looked like. And if a story like this one is what you come here for, there is another one waiting for you right now. The photograph stayed in the window for 2 weeks, which was longer than Ruth usually kept any single image there. She noticed she had left it there on a Tuesday morning when she went to water the small plant on the sill, and she decided to leave it a little longer. There was no particular reason. She just wanted to. The street had not made a ceremony of what it had done. That was the other thing Otis kept coming back to in the weeks after the closing. In the small private thinking he did in the workshop or on the morning walks he took when the weather allowed. Nobody had held a press conference. Nobody had put up a sign or worn matching shirts or made a video about it. Claudette had not even told Ruth who had contributed what, which was a mercy Ruth had not thought to ask for, but felt when she understood it was being given. She did not know, for instance, that Phyllis had taken 3 shares. She did not know that Henry, who lived next door and who had never once in 22 years mentioned the soup, that Ruth had left on his porch every day for 2 weeks during the hard winter of his wife's illness, had been one of the first to confirm. She would not know these things unless they told her, and they had not told her, and the not telling was its own kind of grace. What Ruth did know was the feeling she had standing into the front room the evening the listing came down. Otis had handed her the folded paper, and she had taken it and held it for a moment, and what she had felt was not relief exactly. Though relief was part of it, it was something older and quieter than relief. It was the feeling of being known, of having 40 years of small faithful things add up to something visible, something that the people around her had seen and decided was worth protecting. She was not a woman given to the word worthy, which had always seemed to her like a word people said when they meant something else. She did not think in terms of deserving. She thought in terms of showing up, of the daily ordinary disciplines, caring for the people around you without keeping score. She had done that for 40 years on Delmont Avenue. Not because she expected anything back, but because it was the right way to live. And because Otis had shown her by example, from the first year of their marriage, that a life built on small, persistent kindnesses was a life built on something solid. What she had not expected was for the solid thing to hold her up when she needed it. The Reverend visited in December, between the closing and Christmas, and sat in the front room with a cup of Ruth's coffee, and said something that Ruth wrote down afterward in the small notebook she kept in her nightstand. He said, "The body of Christ is not the building, it's the people who show up." He was talking about Delmont Avenue, and he was talking about something larger than Delmont Avenue, and Ruth knew both things at once, and wrote down what he said anyway, because some things are worth writing down. Otis was slower to talk about it, because Otis was always slower to talk about anything that had moved him. He mentioned it once, in March, to Henry, standing in the driveway between their 2 houses while Henry was getting into his car. He said, "I want you to know I know what you did." Henry started to say something and Otis said, "No, let me say it." He said that he had been on this street for 40 years, and I have tried to be a neighbour worth having. I did not know whether it amounted to anything. He paused for a moment. He said, "I know now." Henry did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We know too." That was the end of the conversation. They were both the kind of men for whom that was enough. The medical bills were paid in December, all of them, from the escrow that Deirdre had set up specifically to ensure the funds went directly to the providers and not through an intermediary that might complicate that tax structure. Lorraine had managed the payments herself, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop on a Thursday evening in mid-December, going through the accounts one by one, clearing each balance to 0 and taking a screenshot as she went. When she was done, she had a folder on her desktop called Cleared, with 23 screenshots in it. She sat and looked at the folder for a moment. Then she made herself another cup of coffee and called her mother, and Ruth answered on the second ring, and Lorraine told her it was done. And the 2 of them sat on the phone together, in the particular quiet of a thing that had been very heavy for a very long time becoming, at last, light. In the spring, Ruth planted the garden again. Her knees still objected, but she had a foam kneeling pad that Lorraine had sent from Memphis, and a pair of gloves with the grip pads on the palms, and she planted tomatoes in the second week of April, the same week she always did, because there was a right week for tomatoes, and Ruth had known what it was for 37 years. The soil turned dark and soft under the trowel. The garden had not been neglected during the hard months, not exactly, though Ruth had been less attentive than usual. Her attention pulled elsewhere by the shoeboxes and the medications and the listing in the window. The perennials had kept themselves. The tomatoes were starting fresh, the way tomatoes did, requiring nothing from the previous year, and asking only for the right attention in the present one. Claudette came out of her house across the street while Ruth was kneeling in the garden and called over to ask if she needed anything from the store. Ruth said she was fine, thank you, and Claudette said, "You say that every time." And Ruth laughed, a real laugh, the sound of it catching Otis in the workshop, where he was working on a small bracket clock for the couple in the house at the corner who had asked him the previous fall and who he had not forgotten. He heard the laugh and felt, without stopping what he was doing, the same settling he had felt on the sidewalk in February. Some things you do not need to name. Some things you simply carry forward. The listing had been gone for 5 months. The workshop smelled of cedar and metal and the faint mineral tang of clock oil. The garden was planted. The coffee cup with the saucer was on the nightstand every morning at 6:15, which was where it had always been and where it would continue to be for as long as Otis had anything to say about it. On Delmont Avenue, spring came in slow and ordinary, the trees leafing out one by one, each house waking up in its usual way, the street looking, to anyone who passed through it, like any other quiet street. It did not look like a place where something had happened. You would have had to know. And the people who knew were not the kind of people who needed it to look like anything at all. The framed payment confirmation still hung in the hallway next to the school portraits. Otis had not taken it down after the house was listed. He had not been able to bring himself to, and Ruth had not suggested it. It marked something real, that photograph, a decade-long discipline, a mortgage paid month by month on a custodian's salary and a laundry worker's earnings, with nothing left over most years but enough. They had bought the house in 1983 for $68,000, which, at the time, had required every dollar they had saved, and a loan from Ruth's mother that they paid back over 4 years, $20 at a time, because that was what they could spare, and because Ruth's mother had not asked for a repayment schedule, only their word. The word had been kept. The house had been theirs, free and clear for 15 years before the shoeboxes. The fact that it was still theirs had been arranged by the people on their street without being asked, and that fact sat alongside the framed confirmation in the hallway and made a different kind of picture than either would have made alone. Otis had started taking on more clockwork in the spring, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. He had a waiting list, which was new, because he had never kept a waiting list before, having always worked on whatever came to him whenever it came. The list started because the Mendozas had told someone, and that someone had told someone else, and by March he had 4 clocks waiting on the shelf in the workshop, and a note in his handwriting on the pegboard above the workbench with the names, and the dates, and the brief description of the problem with each one. He worked through them in the evenings after dinner, an hour or two at the bench, the magnifying glass on its swing arm positioned just so, the small tools laid out in the order he preferred. The work was its own reward in the way all good work is its own reward, and the fact that it mattered to the people who brought him their clocks made it matter more, not because he needed the validation, but because the exchange was honest, and the exchange was human, and those were the things Otis valued above everything except Ruth. Ruth, for her part, had taken back the chairmanship of the fall fundraiser with a renewed focus that she attributed to having one fewer thing weighing on her. She had a planning meeting in April at the church and came home with a yellow legal pad full of notes and a calendar marked with dates and the names of the committee volunteers, and she spread it all on the kitchen table and reviewed it while Otis made dinner. and she hummed something low and steady while she worked, which was what she did when she was genuinely engaged with a task and not simply managing it. Otis heard the humming and stirred the pot on the stove and did not say anything because the moment did not require anything. It was, simply, the ordinary evening in the ordinary kitchen of the house on Delmont Avenue, and after the months it had cost them to keep it, ordinary had never sounded so good. The Pastoral Care Fund contribution from the church had been Reverend Sams's doing, though he had not announced it and would not have been comfortable if anyone had made a production of it. He had gone to the deacons with the request in a regular monthly meeting, framed plainly, and the deacons had voted without a lengthy discussion, which was how that congregation made its decisions when the matter was clear. Reverend Sams had called Marcus afterward to pass along the amount, and Marcus had updated the spreadsheet and then closed the laptop and sat in his kitchen for a moment, thinking about the kind of community that could move that quickly when something needed to happen, and about how rarely people understood what they were part of until they saw it do something. His own children did not fully understand what their father had spent those weeks working on. They knew he had been up late at the kitchen table. His older daughter, who was 14 and observant in the way that 14-year-olds are when they are paying attention to how their parents move through the world, had asked him once what he was doing. He had tried to explain it in terms she would understand. He told her about the Caldwells, about Otis and Ruth, about the clocks Otis fixed and the soup Ruth made, and the years of small daily things that had passed unremarked between neighbours who had been, in every way that mattered, a kind of family to the whole street. His daughter had listened and then asked, "So we're buying their house so they can keep living in it?" And Marcus had said something like that, yes. She had thought about it for a moment and then said, "That seems right," which was the analysis, stripped to its cleanest form. Marcus had agreed that it seemed right and had gone back to his spreadsheet. The closing documents were stored in Deirdre's firm's archive and in a folder in Marcus's filing cabinet in the Home Office and in a PDF on Lorraine's desktop labelled simply Delmont. The legal instrument was not simple, but what it said in practice was simple enough. The Caldwells could not be displaced from the house on Delmont Avenue for as long as either of them lived, regardless of what happened to the property's assessed value or to the finances of any individual household that had contributed. Deirdre had written in specific protections for that contingency, because she was a thorough lawyer and because she had recognized, partway through drafting the instrument, that she was writing something she wanted to get right. She had billed for fewer hours than she had worked. She had not mentioned this to anyone. Summer came. Ruth's tomatoes came in the way they always did in the second week of August, heavy and warm and smelling like the inside of a greenhouse. She brought a basket of them to Claudette, who made a sauce that lasted into November in her freezer. She left a bag on Henry's porch without knocking, which was the way she had always done it, and Henry found it when he came home from his afternoon walk and stood at the door for a moment before taking them inside. The gesture had not changed. The weight behind it had not changed. What had changed was that Henry knew something he had not known before about what it meant for Ruth to have a porch to leave things on, and a garden to put the tomatoes in, and he felt that knowledge quietly and did not need to say it aloud. In September, Otis had finished the last clock on the waiting list and added 3 more from a new round of neighbours who had heard, and he was content. He was not a man who used the word content easily, having grown up with the understanding that contentment was something you held lightly because it could be interrupted, but he had earned the right to use it now. The workshop was his. The house was theirs. The street was, as it had always been, and as it was now secure to remain, home. He found the folded listing in a kitchen drawer in October, where it had ended up after being recycled, rescued by Ruth without her quite knowing why, tucked under some take-out menus and a roll of masking tape. He held it for a moment without opening it. He thought about what it had meant when it went up, and what it meant now, folded and wedged under a take-out menu in a drawer in a kitchen, in a house that was not going anywhere. He put it back under the menu. He did not open it. There was nothing in it he needed to read.